Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Blake Johnson. The Senate parliamentarian has issued her guidance regarding the immigration sections of Democrats' reconciliation package. We look at the recent Haitian migrant emergency on our southern border and touch on the newly proposed federal regulation for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. As always, we have BPC regulars Teresa Cardinal-Brown and Siddiqa Nepal to break it down for you. But first, we have a special guest. BPC's Senior Vice President Bill Hoagland is here to help us understand the history of budget reconciliation and the Byrd Rule. Lots to come, so stick around. After months of speculation as to whether immigration reform might make its way into the Democrats' reconciliation package, the Senate parliamentarian finally released her opinion, stating that the proposed immigration language for the reconciliation package, which would have legalized up to 8 million people, does not pass the Byrd Rule. Democrats vowed to take a second shot with different language, but were yet again rejected. To talk about this ruling, the history of the budget reconciliation, and the role of the Senate parliamentarian, we're going to turn it over to our resident budget guru, Bill Hoagland, and we'll be joined by Teresa Cardinal-Brown. You can find them on Twitter at Bill Hoagland and at BPC_T Brown. Welcome, Bill and Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you, Blake. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Blake. Good to be here.
Bill, let's turn to you first. You've been working on budgets since the Nixon administration and were a staffer in the Senate when the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act that created the reconciliation process was created. Can you give us a little background on the act, its purpose, and how it's been traditionally used?
Sure. Thank you, Blake. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, enacted in 1974, established two new committees, the Senate Budget Committee and House Budget Committee, and the Congressional Budget Office. And that is where I really began my career on Capitol Hill when CBO was established in 1975-76. The Budget Act itself was designed to put some order in the fiscal policy setting. At that particular time, important was President Nixon had impounded money, and so this is why it's the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. But in the process of doing something to fix impoundments that were felt to be illegal by the president, they established this budget process with the full design to be able to have the so-called the right hand know what the left hand was doing, what the revenue committees were doing, what the spending committees were doing, so that we would have a fiscal blueprint going forward. And out of this came the establishment of this act established procedures, and one of those procedures was if you're going to use this act for purposes under fast-track procedures, special procedures, could not filibuster a budget resolution in the Senate. You could not filibuster a reconciliation bill that might be by a budget resolution. You would had some benchmarks that you had to stick to, and one of those was what Senator Byrd and one of the founders of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Majority Leader Howard Baker, established the rules that became known as the Byrd Rules. It said, listen, if you're going to use this process to pass legislation, it has to be budgetarily focused. And there were a number of very specific provisions, that 5 provisions, 6 provisions, that were later codified into law in 1985, that are the law that when you consider a bill that's been generated by the budget resolution, a reconciliation, it has to have budgetary consequences. And I think we're getting to the point here of this podcast to focus on, well, why is it that you can't make changes in immigration law or maybe in climate change or in healthcare? Why does the parliamentarian say that the law doesn't permit it? And let me pause here for just a minute to express our sincere hope and prayers for the Senate parliamentarian who's going through some very difficult, on top of everything else she has to deal with, some personal health problems, and wish her the best. But her ruling, and by the way, it's an advice. I'm glad you said this, Blake. She, the chief parliamentarian, advises who's sitting in the chair. She doesn't rule. The chair rules. Historically, the chair follows the advice of the parliamentarian. And in this particular case on immigration, I think it's very clear She's focusing specifically on one of the what we call the Byrd Rule violations, which is maybe it does have budgetary consequences. Some of these provisions that advocates want to have for immigration reform, maybe it does. But is that really the purpose of why you're putting it in this budgetary bill? And so it falls under what we call merely incidental. Yes, it has consequences. Does not really, the policy is more important than the budgetary consequences. And I think that's her advice, has been her advice in the last two rulings that she's giving to the chair. So with that, I'll stop.
Yeah, just a quick follow up on that. On this, the language and everything else that she went through, as you said. You're saying that the budget aspect to it was merely incidental, and not the purpose of the language that was added. Now, but my follow up question here is, as you said, she's giving her advice. She's advising on this. Can, say, Senate Majority Leader Schumer simply ignore her advice?
Well, Senate Majority Leader Schumer would not be sitting in the chair. President pro tem of the Senate would either be the Vice President of the United States or the senior senator. It would be Senator Leahy. Could the chair ignore her advice? Certainly, chair could. The chair could say, "Fine, I hear you, but I disagree. It does not." And my ruling is it does not violate the rule. At that particular point, any United States senator could stand up and say, I challenge the ruling of the chair. Unfortunately, to challenge the ruling of the chair would require 60 votes to overcome the ruling of the chair. And so the ruling of the chair that this particular provision did not stand would continue on, because I doubt if there would be 60 votes to overcome the ruling of the chair.
So the ruling of the chair, the ruling is that the chair could say, like, we're disregarding this. We're going to leave it in. And the only way that you could overcome that, Senator Leahy, overcome that is with 60 votes, which Republicans would not have to remove it, strike it, and then it would move forward. Now, what's the hesitation for the chair to not go against the advice of the parliamentarian?
First of all, it would be almost what I would argue would be nuclear. We've had this problem before. Basically, what you're saying is that none of this applies, that you can have legislation that is not budgetary related. You can do anything you want to, and effectively, we all understand what maybe the underlying purpose of all this pressure is on reconciliation. Effectively, you've done away with any kind of filibuster, because this is a fast track. Like I say, this is a fast track piece of legislation. It only requires 51 votes to pass this. And by the hesitation of the chair will be, you're setting a precedent here that effectively, in my words, and I'll go out on a limb here, you've basically done away with the Budget Act. It no longer means anything, and reconciliation no longer means anything as it relates to fiscal policy. It basically becomes a tool for effectively bypassing the filibuster in the United States Senate.
And so we're removing sort of the strictures of the Senate, the way we keep things in bounds, and how we sort of have a broader consensus for the legislation that gets passed through the Senate, sort of the cooling saucer that is the hot cup of tea of the House, is what you're getting at.
Yeah, I think to be honest with you, I think from this whole exercise this year of reconciliation has been to put pressure on the United States Senate to eventually do away with the filibuster. I'm an old Senate staffer, maybe an old institutionalist in that sense. I think that would be a mistake, but certainly there's a lot of pressure out here to do legislation. And when you have a 50-50 Senate, it's very difficult to get anything done unless it is done in a bipartisan way, which, of course, from the Bipartisan Policy Center, we think. Personally, I'll leave it to Teresa to talk about this. I'm not opposed to immigration reform. I'm not opposed to legislation dealing with the climate. A lot of this stuff is good, needs to be addressed, but it should be addressed in a bipartisan way, not in a partisan manner, because in a partisan manner, what can be done in a partisan manner by one Congress under one control of one party can be undone by the next Congress. And if we're looking for long-term stability and policy, we want things to be done in a bipartisan way.
Well, with that, let me turn to you, Teresa. As Bill says, if we do it in a partisan, razor-thin margin, it can be easily undone the same way. I think we've seen that with President Trump's attempts to undo DACA, which has had a lot of implications for millions of people in the United States. And on this, trying to move additional clarification and status changes to millions of immigrants here. What do you make of the parliamentarians' advice, the ruling, so to speak? And does this shut the door on immigration reform through reconciliation?
I do think so. I mean, I think as Bill has laid out, it could be the parliamentarians' advice could be ignored by Vice President Harris if she's in the chair. And frankly, for this kind of a vote, she's going to be in the chair because they need her vote. I want to remind everybody, people talk about the Democratic majority in the Senate. The Democrats don't actually have a majority in the Senate. It's 50-50. It's evenly split. They have control of the Senate by virtue of the fact that the vice president has a tie-breaking vote. But the vice president doesn't vote all the time. The vice president votes only when there is a tie. So it means that it's not a full control all the time. And one senator being out changes that dynamic. So it's very tenuous at best. I think that makes it, frankly, I think less likely that the vice president or Leader Schumer or the president, for that matter, would advocating for overruling the parliamentarian here. I know that's what immigration advocates are pushing. There's been a lot of people saying that Schumer should just fire the parliamentarian and get someone who will rule in their favor. I think all of those things are somewhat unlikely. And I think it's because they do understand the potential consequences here. And the parliamentarian in her first ruling said as much, that if this were allowed, a subsequent Congress could easily undo it. And I think Bill's point is worth kind of repeating here. We have seen the challenge that seesawing immigration policy from one administration to another administration based on executive action can have on people's lives, not just how the government functions, but actual people's lives. It would almost be worse if Congress was passing laws and then undoing them 2 years or 4 years later. That's worse because legislation is supposed to have a more lasting, almost permanent effect. And it may be harder to undo something once it's done, but not if you take away these rules that make it harder to undo something once it's done. And so I think that it's worth thinking a little bit beyond the immediate, understandable frustration of immigration advocates that Congress hasn't been able to get anything done. They say they're trying a plan C. What I have heard, all of the arguments against the parliamentarian's ruling are that she failed to say that the budgetary impact was significant, but that's not what she said. The Byrd Rule, in her interpretation, means that the budgetary effect has to be the primary purpose, not the incidental impact of a policy. And it's very clear that the primary purpose of all of this is to legalize those who are undocumented. That's who is pushing for it. It's not the budget people that are pushing for it. It's not the fiscal people of the United States that are pushing for it. It's the immigrants and the families and the people that support them who are pushing for it. And so it is a very important policy that has significant budgetary impacts, but the budgetary impacts are not the primary reason for doing it. Now, have there been other rulings by the parliamentarian that would argue against that? Quite possibly. But I think in the position we're in now, I think it's unlikely that this is going to make it through on reconciliation. And I'd also just point out, and Bill can back me up here, even if immigration was not an issue whatsoever, if the parliamentarian had said thumbs up, this whole package right now is hanging by a lot of threads and still may fail on any other aspect. So it's still a very high risk maneuver.
So Teresa, if we think that immigration reform through reconciliation is likely not going to take place, immigration advocates, as you said, are still trying to work a plan C, D, or E. What after all this is said and done, reconciliation passes, it doesn't pass. Immigration is not going to be likely to be a part of it. What do they do next? Where should their energy go? How do we actually get immigration reform that, as you said, immigrant families who have been pushing for this have been really trying to find whatever avenue is there to get policy changes done. And I know that you've advocated for, BPC, has advocated for regular order on legislation. What's your proposal and where should they focus?
Well, I think where they're going to focus is on trying to end the filibuster, but I think that has less of a chance than getting it on reconciliation, because we know that there's at least one Democratic senator who will not support eliminating the filibuster, and we have not heard anyone from leadership thinking that that is likely to happen or that is the way to go. So I think that is even less of a chance. I think it means going back to the drawing board. I think it definitely does mean restarting some conversations with those Republicans who are willing to talk about the issue. Who are willing to try to work it out. And that's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. There is definitely a lack of trust on both sides that people are negotiating in good faith. I think, we have continued to push very hard on what are the most, if you will, challenging and problematic issues. For good reason. There are problems that need to be dealt with, the status of the undocumented and what we do about border security. But those are also the issues that are hardest for the other side to accept. So we're basically demanding the most for the least, and that on both sides of the aisle here, and that's not likely to get you to yes. We have done polling with Morning Consult earlier this year that showed that there's less of a difficulty when people talk about their, if you will, their lower priorities, and that means the legal immigration system. And we've already seen a lot of bipartisanship and a lot of bipartisan work on bills that have passed at least one house of Congress addressing legal immigration, whether it's the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act or the new version, the EAGLE Act, or the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which would include legalization for a lot of farm workers, but also reforms the farm labor legal immigration categories for temporary workers. The Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, or other bills that would recapture employment-based and family-based green cards, people who have legally waited in line. Those provisions might actually help some of the undocumented who might have an avenue to legalize if some of that were to pass. And if it can be proven that you can get a deal there, it might open the doorway for discussions of other issues. I know that the Dream DACA thing is also very important to a lot of folks. That is and has been a clearly bipartisan issue. And it's true that a majority of Americans would support legalizing people already here, but we still have to convince those 100 senators and 435 members of Congress to agree to that. And that doesn't always happen. So as hard as it is, that may be the resort, is we have to go back to the table and try to renegotiate. There's a lot of time before the next election. We know that this is going to be an issue in the next election, but if we throw up our hands and give up all possibility between now and then, I think it will just make things harder to come back to the table later. So I'd like to see those bipartisan conversations starting up again and see where we get. And it may not be everything, but if we can get, it's like the ground game in football, right? Game 3 yards this time and 3 yards this time and 4 yards next time, and you get another first down and you get to try again. Let's see if we can do something like that.
Well, with Teresa leaving with some Big Ten football there, Bill, a Purdue man himself. So I'm sure you guys can both enjoy some of that, thinking about how we actually make progress that's stable. Bill, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this segment today and offering your insights.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Next, we turn to immigration issues that have been at the forefront of news this week. Images of Haitian migrants huddled under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas, have dominated the press. The Biden administration has received criticism from both Republicans and Democrats for its handling of this emergency. Immigrant advocates have also bashed the administration for relying on Title 42 to manage this inflow. To break down the situation at the border, Teresa and I will be joined by BPC immigration fellow Sadiqa Nepal, who you can follow on Twitter at Sadiqa_Nepal. Welcome back, Sadiqa.
Hi, Blake.
So, Sadiqa, we've all seen the images of the migrants waiting under the bridge. It's hot. It's 100 degrees. There have also been images of Border Patrol agents on horseback recently chasing down some of these migrants who are crossing the river. But I wanted to ask you, can we get a little context on what's causing this emergency at the border?
Yeah. So when we talk about this emergency, right, from month after month that I've come on this podcast to talk about the border numbers, we have constantly highlighted that the other category of migrants other than Northern Triangle are relatively growing at an exponential rate. Hey, look out, look out. And most of the time when we were saying this, we were reporting that Haitian migrants are one of them that are crossing the border at an exponential rate in this other category, along with Cubans and other nationalities. But Haitians were coming up over and over again. So when this emergency comes all of a sudden, it's not all of a sudden. It's never all of a sudden. There's always a trend that follows this. So now all of a sudden, as it seems in the media, there are 14 to 15,000 migrants huddled under a bridge in Del Rio. This trend is not just particularly secluded to Haiti. A lot of countries in Northern Triangle, a lot of countries in South America and Central America are struggling with COVID, with national calamities, with economic burdens, and we are seeing this trend of people leaving these harsh conditions. What makes Haiti a little different is that they are going through an extreme political turmoil, humanitarian, economic hurdles within the country, but it's been going on for decades. One of the major migration trends that happened out of Haiti was perhaps in 2010 earthquake. So when we talk about all these Haitians in the border now, they're actually coming from many countries in Central America and in South America, most of them from Chile, from Guatemala, from Brazil, through Mexico. Why are they coming all of this time? I mean, perhaps because, COVID has made life much harder in these other countries outside of Haiti. So a lot of these migrants are working in these labor factories. Labor is hard to come by in Central America, in South America. Folks from these countries themselves are leaving, so it's hard for Haitians to stay there. On top of that, it's not like they can go back to Haiti. In July, there was an assassination of their president. In August, there was this massive earthquake. And to fuel all of this, the U.S. policy has been generous to Haiti this year. In May, TPS for Haiti was allowed, and Haitians who were in the United States up until July 29th could stay under this TPS thing. So, Biden administration has changed that lens in comparison to Trump, where they do seem welcoming. So everything compounded, everything happening all at the same time, it's created this explosion. But it's not to say that folks haven't been flagging this or tracking this. One more thing I will add is that this crisis, as much as it seems like it's over and it's like it's taken a backseat in the news, like now, there is a huge migratory trend happening in Panama of Haitian migrants officials in Panama are sort of flagging this, that like these people are crossing, and perhaps there's this whole mobility of Haitian migration happening in Northern America, and for United States, if they want to manage it properly, this is the time, so that they're not repeating the same mistakes of what happened this time around.
So to go back to that thing you just mentioned about Panama, are you saying that the Haitian migrants had been naturalized to Panama and are moving towards the U.S., or that they were moving into Panama from somewhere else?
They're passing through Panama.
Okay.
They're passing through Panama in really big number, and none of these Haitian migrants have naturalized in any of these countries. They're there as temporary labor migrants, and because labor, due to COVID, due to national calamities, due to climate change, all of these shifts in labor is happening. They're not finding jobs in these areas either. So it's not just that factor. Mm-hmm. There's many other factors, but this is underlying factors that we need to understand that the Haitian migrants that are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, not all of them are coming from Haiti. And they're coming from all of the other places as well.
And looking at those images, it appeared to be, that these were large numbers of Haitian migrants, all of one, nationality. Were they all moving together, are they part of larger, say, caravans or populations that are moving as in one group, or how
I
are
wouldn't
they
say that.
going?
I wouldn't say that they're moving all together. There's not this like ping network of like, let's all go to the US. It's these compounded issues that are happening all over the continent. For example, things are hard in Haiti themselves. Like I mentioned, there is the assassination, there is the earthquake, but the major Haitian migration that had happened in 2010 after that major earthquake that we all probably remember. And so for a decade now, these Haitians have been living in countries all over South America. There was a huge migratory trend that happened after 2010 to Brazil. They worked on the World Cup after that. There was, they were working in these labor factories in Brazil, Chile, Guatemala. They were all over Central America. And we're seeing trends out of these places in general. Brazilians are moving. Central Americans from Guatemala are moving. Guatemalans, Chileans, they're all moving. And Haitians can't go back. So it's a factor that has compounded on top, one thing on top of the other.
Yeah,
So
I would just, if I can jump in there, like if I can jump in, I just want to add that, I think we sometimes overestimate the formality of the networks that drive migration. Yes, there are organized smuggling networks that facilitate migration. Most of those have been centralized in Central America and Mexico. But particularly in the Haitian community, the migrants themselves are talking to each other. So the migrants who are in Chile are talking to the migrants who are in Brazil, who are talking to the migrants who have just come up to Panama or who are waiting to go through the Darien Gap. The ones who've gone to Mexico they're all on internet channels now, telling each other their experiences and what they expect when they get to the border. And it's an imperfect game of telephone. If we all remember that game from when we were kids, where you sit in a circle and one person whispers something in one ear and you see how it comes out when it gets passed around to the other end. It's very much like that. And so the information they're getting is somewhat delayed and somewhat imperfect. And so some are saying, hey, I managed to get in, and Biden, we heard through some network that Biden is being more open. Then that makes its way down and people start the journey. People who have arrived and not been admitted, there's folks already making their way north who won't have heard that yet. So the messaging that any government wants to send is very much difficult. It's not the primary way that many migrant groups get their information or who they're going to be listening to.
Teresa hits a point there that like family networks are as important as smuggling networks. And the instances of folks that do make it in, those stories travel with a lot more weight. If this person get in, I rather take that lottery chance. It's all a lottery chance in essence, right?
So how is the Biden administration doing with this? How are they addressing it? What is your opinion on their handling of this? So I don't want to say surge. It's more of like we're seeing like a steady flow now at a much higher rate of people crossing the border just because of all these different factors that you've alluded to.
I mean, Biden administration, I think for Haiti and generally to deal with migration trends in the southern border has relied on tactics of administration past. There has been nothing that has come out of the administration that has been new to think about how to think about it differently. And not only have they relied on tactics of the administration past, it almost seems like they pick and choose the bad tactics of the administration past, right? Like the unpopular ones. They'll pick Title 42, that is super unpopular. There was a time when they were thinking about putting these Haitian migrants in Guantanamo. Like we've tried that in 1991 and that was super unpopular. That it received huge backlash. I don't even think the administration went through with that. Let's talk about the horseback riding. This is not a new policy. We've been doing horseback riding on the border for 100 years. And when the Biden administration blames CBP for doing their job, they are the ones who are supposed to be doing this oversight. Like, it's not the horse's fault. I mean, to some degree, I guess you could do the horse traveling differently, but like they talk about it as if it's everybody else's fault but theirs. I mean, they've taken some responsibility of it. But I will say that the reliance on Title 42, in particular, a Trump era policy that we keep saying here, they got rid of what 8,000 or 6 to 8,000 Haitian migrants back to the country in 17 flights, because interestingly, Title 42 runs out today. There was a judge in Texas that ruled that Title 42 is essentially illegal and cannot be instituted. So they got rid of a huge chunk of population before it became too late for them to do so. So they did call it like a public health emergency, but that is in essence the immigration policy that the Biden administration has relied on. They've also I think it was 8,000 people have been returned to Mexico, but like I mentioned in my earlier context too, like we know that more people are coming through Panama. So we know that this case is not over, but the Biden administration keeps relying on these tactics, these tried again tactics that we clearly know that does not work. They're not popular. And what's very interesting is that, perhaps trying to put Haitian migrants in 1991 didn't get as much pushback. I mean, I wasn't around at the time. And perhaps like Obama trying to put these people in detention camps doesn't get any pushback. But particularly since the Trump administration, the focus on U.S.-Mexico border policy and the focus on immigration in the U.S. has shifted so much in the public narrative and the public view that you can't pass with doing these kind of things anymore. Like people are acutely aware of what's happening in the immigration sphere or how a presidential administration responds to emergency crisis like this. And I think that's because the Guantanamo whole thing got such a big pushback, is that folks don't want to see these kind of policy changes happening anymore. And I think the administration must come up with something different. It has to think outside of the box. It's not going to work.
Well, and, you made a point there that the Biden administration has taken responsibility. I think that they've actually done the opposite. They've actually gone out and blamed the
horses.
CBP officers and the horses for creating these bad images when they're using the simple tools that have been in use for years took a bad image. They were focused on the image rather than the policy. And I think that I think we need to take a quick bird's eye view and just lift back up here from this, because that the administration is in crisis control mode, I think that what we want to focus on here, and Teresa, what I'm going to turn to you for, what do you think the Biden administration could learn from past episodes? What lessons should they take from that? And what should a policy framework look to tactically manage this situation?
Yeah. So a couple of things from what Sadiksha said. I think this administration is learning and taking all the wrong lessons from previous administrations and doubling down on this policy of deterrence. We're going to send harsh messages not to come. We will, prevent as many people as possible from coming to the border. We'll talk about the border being closed. We'll send people back home. As I've said before, the effectiveness deterrence is inverse to the desperation of the migrants. Deterrence effects decrease the more desperate the migration. And what we have seen since the mid-2010s is increasing desperation of migrants coming from further away, fleeing more and more desperate circumstances. This isn't a traditional labor migration. These are people who really believe that there is nothing for them to return to. They have nothing back home. This is not about making a few dollars more in the United States. This is really, for them, they believe, life or death. Now, does that make them eligible for asylum in the United States? Not necessarily, but it does mean that we're dealing with more of a humanitarian crisis than an immigration crisis. And traditional deterrence and law enforcement tools are not going to work in a humanitarian crisis, and increasingly create these jarring images. President Obama had kids in cages, and President Trump was tearing children from families, and now President Biden has people on horseback chasing people of color. None of those images address a humanitarian concern and have generated huge blowback. So a few things that I think the administration needs to think about, and we've written about this in our Rethinking Border Security piece, but one thing is to note what Sadiksha said. They should not have been surprised at this. We have been documenting since July the increase in these non-Central American, non-Mexican arrivals at the border. People at the border have been talking about that. I guarantee you folks in CBP and Border Patrol have been telling their headquarters about this. The government of Panama has been saying that they have been telling the United States government that these Haitians and others are moving north, and the government is not preparing for this. So I think that we need to have a better system in place where we pay attention to migratory actions in our hemisphere that will eventually come to our border and start preparing before they arrive, and not rely on other governments to essentially interdict and stop them all along the way as our only response. The other thing we need to do is, frankly, we need to look at our asylum system. If these are humanitarian migrants, they have a right under law to ask for asylum. They don't have a right to receive it unless they meet the legal qualifications, but they have a right to ask and have that case be heard. And yet we consistently fail to adapt our asylum system to this increase in pressure. So we have not invested in our asylum system. We've invested in increasing deterrence, which, as I've said, has had a decreasing impact. If we invested in our asylum system and created means to hear asylum cases more rapidly with due process, prioritizing those arriving at the border, then people will feel like they had a chance and didn't make the cut. And then we can, I think, legitimately send them back home at that point. But to insist that we cut off all avenues for them to even make that case, I think is undermining not only our standing in the world as we ask other countries to grant them asylum, but also undermining our ability to actually manage what is happening at the border. And so I think we do need to look at this as a humanitarian situation and an immigration and migration management situation, and not a law enforcement situation. I think that's really fundamentally where this is coming at.
As you mentioned, reforming the asylum process and getting that quickly administered. Does that require Congress, or is the administration able to do that themselves? Because that's a potential hangup, right?
It doesn't necessarily require Congress. It would be helpful if Congress came on board, particularly because the resources that is needed to do it. But I think that, Congress has to come to the same realization the administration has to come to, which is throwing more money at Border Patrol and on deterrence effects is not really making a difference. The border fence would not have made a difference. And increasingly these policies that they have relied on are being undercut by the courts. As Sadiksha mentioned, as of today we're recording on September 30th, the court has decided that Title 42 as it applies to families is illegal. And so the United States has to figure out how they're going to process families in the United States. It's only a half skip and a jump for that also to be then ruled illegal for single adults. One court has ordered MPP to be started up, but another court has ordered that MPP be terminated. And the administration today said they were going to write a new memorandum terminating MPP to hopefully meet legal muster. There are challenges, to be sure, but we have proven when we need to and want to, let's look at the Afghan evacuation, we can muster the necessary resources to treat people as a humanitarian cause. And so I think we need to think about that seriously. And frankly, managing this at the border in a humanitarian way will look more like managing and less like chaos.
Well, and we'll leave this section there. We're in crisis. For our final section, we turn to the newly proposed federal regulation on DACA that was just published this week. The White House issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that would create a formal regulation for the DACA program, which was originally created and has been run based on a memorandum from former Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano back in 2012. Sadiksha, first let's come to you. Logistics. Why is this regulation necessary if the program has already been in place for years? And what would this regulation do that would be different than what it was under the current DACA program?
So I think it's necessary because DACA has been around for so long. I think we might have forgotten that it was never codified and it was never into regulation. It was actually a DHS memo. So this takes the step to formally put into regulation, to codify DACA. But this is in spite of all of the legal challenges that DACA has been going through. And it doesn't really mean that, putting this in federal regulation doesn't really respond to the Texas law about DACA that came out that says that it doesn't matter whether it's a federal regulation or if it was a DHS memo. It is an overreach for the executive to consider to implement DACA, that Congress must do something about Dreamers and this population in general. But they're doing it in spite of that. Now, does anything change within the language of DACA? No. Like, it's most of the statutory things that was in the DHS memo has remained the same. You have to be 16 years old. You have to have been in the U.S. since 2007, have to have a high school degree. All of those things are the same. I think they're just trying to take a step to fortify it, to make it stronger. But I'm not necessarily sure if it answers the fundamental question about the legality of DACA as it has been ruled by the courts. So they can try to do that. Some of the stuff that they have actually responded to, some other court hearings, is interesting. I think they finally, in this federal regulation, separated DACA from work permit, which would have required person who's applying for DACA to have a work permit in the past. Like, according to this regulation, you can apply for a DACA even if you don't have a work permit. But they also make terminating DACA like relatively streamlined, or terminating work permits relatively streamlined too. So there are some things that are different there, but for the most part, it's DACA as we know it, and you're trying to make it go through the process that a lot of courts had initially said you should have gone through this process anyway. You don't meet the APA because you didn't do a comment and notice period. So I think the Biden administration is like, oh man, we need to do this now. So here we are going through the notice and comment period, but I don't think it fundamentally sort of responds to the court's decision that it's not legal, that Congress must do this.
Well, Teresa, I'll ask you just to follow up on that. Based on Judge Hannon in Texas and his ruling, what does this do in your eyes?
I think I agree with Sadiksha. I mean, one of the key things that Judge Hannon issued his ruling on was based on the DACA decision against Trump's rescission of DACA that went to the Supreme Court. And in that decision, the Supreme Court dinged the administration for not considering that they might just take away the work authorization and leave the deportation protection, that they had to rescind the whole thing. And that you have to consider alternatives to everything or nothing. And that is, as Sadiksha said, one of the key components of this proposed regulation. It would require two separate applications. So right now, for someone to apply for DACA, there's not a DACA application form. They apply for work authorization. And in that application, they say, I'm applying for work authorization under the DACA memorandum. Right? So it's essentially one application that serves two purposes. This would separate it. So not everybody would have to apply for both. It would require somebody to pay two fees. Let's be clear. And not everybody would need work authorization necessarily if they're a full-time student, if they are underage and still living at home. I mean, it's true. Not everybody necessarily requires the work authorization, but probably the majority would. I think in addition, there's a lot of really lengthy exposition in the proposed rule that is meant to address the specific allegations in the judge's decision. A lot more backup and detail about why they're taking this. Again, the memorandum, I think, was very short. It was like 2 or 3 pages. And this is like a 25 page regulation. So there's a lot more substance there to kind of underpin the rationale, the authorities they believe they have to do this. If the regulation is enacted, certainly regulatory actions have stronger foundation to last from one administration to another administration. So it would be harder for another administration to take it down. But whether or not it will pass Judge Hannon's court or any other court that rules on this on appeal, I think is very much up in the air, as Sadiksha said, because the fundamental piece of Judge Hannon's ruling is that it overreached the government's authority for deferred action. And so in that, I'm not sure this would actually make a difference in the court case. We have said, we'll continue to say, that DACA recipients, Dreamers, for this to be a legitimate ongoing program, it really should be authorized by Congress. Dreamers, like any other undocumented person, should have a chance to earn status. Congress has to address this. So this takes us right back up to our first conversation with Bill Hoagland today. How does that happen? And I think that if it's not going to happen by reconciliation, we have to get back to a bipartisan process and figure out how we craft solutions that Congress can agree to provide permanent answers for this group of people.
I think we'll leave it there. It's been a busy show today, but lots to cover and lots more to come, which we'll be covering in our next episode. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Blake Johnson. This Week in Immigration was created by executive producer Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Teresa Cardinal Brown, Siddiqua Nepal, and myself. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.